did ancient tribes survive winters so cold that you would struggle to last a single night? Long before electricity, before insulated walls, before a single furnace existed, entire communities lived through seasons where rivers froze solid, where daylight nearly vanished, and where the wind itself could kill. And yet they endured. Children slept safely through blizzards. Fires stayed alive for months. Whole villages survived in places where exposed skin could freeze in minutes. But here is what archaeologists discovered, and it is strange. The people who survived these winters were not simply tougher than us. They understood heat in a way that modern civilization has almost completely forgotten. Buried beneath forests, hidden beside frozen rivers, raised above icy marshlands, they built shelters that behaved almost like living organisms. Shelters that trapped warmth, redirected air, controlled moisture, and used the earth itself as insulation. And one survival technique changed everything. A method so effective that versions of it are still used in Arctic survival systems today. Hold on to that, because by the end, I will show you exactly what it was. For now, imagine you are a child, and this is the first blizzard you will ever remember. The wind is screaming. The world outside is white and deadly, and yet you are warm. Tonight, we uncover how that was even possible. In the subarctic world, winter was not just weather, it was pressure. The cold pressed into clothing. It hardened wet leather into stone. It froze breath into ice. And hour after hour, it drained the warmth from the human body, quietly, relentlessly. Survival depended on one thing above all else: heat retention. Modern homes fight the winter with constant energy, burning fuel without end. The ancient tribes had no such luxury. Every single piece of warmth had to be protected, guarded, never wasted. And it began with a choice, the choice of where to build. Northern peoples often raised their winter shelters deep inside dense spruce forests, where the thick trees broke the killing wind before it could reach them. They avoided the exposed ridges. They avoided the flood zones. They avoided the hollows where drifting snow could bury an entrance overnight. Even the location itself was an act of engineering. And then came the breakthrough. Instead of building upward, into the freezing air, they built downward, into the earth. This was a revolution in survival, because just a few feet below the surface, the temperature of the soil stayed far more stable than the deadly air above it. While the wind outside could fall to 40, 50, even 60 degrees below zero, the earth held a steadier, gentler cold. The ground became a natural blanket. Wind exposure dropped. Heat loss slowed dramatically. A few feet of soil could be the difference between life and death. These half-buried lodges appeared across many different northern cultures, from the Athabaskan peoples of the subarctic forests to the pit house builders of the western plateaus. They appeared again and again for one simple reason: they worked. But digging into the earth was only the skeleton. The real genius was in the layers, and in one strange, low doorway. An ancient winter lodge was never a simple hut. It was a carefully layered system. A large timber frame formed the skeleton. Over it came bark, then moss, then reeds, then sod, and finally packed earth. And every single material had a purpose. Moss trapped air. Earth blocked the wind. Sod held the temperature steady. Wood carried the weight. Nothing was placed without reason. Nothing was wasted. But one detail mattered more than almost any other: the entrance. Many winter shelters used a long, low, tunnel-like entryway. At first, it looks awkward, even foolish. But it solved a deadly problem. Hot air rises, cold air sinks. A normal, open doorway would let the freezing air outside come rushing straight into the living space. But the tunnel slowed that exchange. The cold air stayed low, trapped in the passage, while the precious warmth remained deep inside the lodge. In every meaningful way, These entrances worked like primitive airlocks thousands of years before the word existed. Inside, the sleeping platforms were raised above the floor because the coldest air always settles near the ground. Families slept higher where the air stayed warmer. And the fire itself was managed with surprising wisdom. Great roaring flames burned too much fuel and gave too little in return. So instead, many communities kept steady, low coal fires, less smoke, longer heat, far greater efficiency. Some heated stones beside the fire and tucked them near the sleeping areas, where they released their warmth slowly through the night. Others layered animal furs together, trapping the shared heat of every body beneath them. So picture it now. The child crawls through the long, dark tunnel out of the screaming wind and emerges into a glowing circle of firelight. Warm, quiet, safe. Outside, the blizzard rules the world. Inside, the family has built a small pocket of life. But that warmth hit a silent killer. A sealed lodge could take an entire family in their sleep. Warmth alone could not save them, because a sealed lodge with no airflow became a trap. Smoke inhalation, moisture buildup, carbon monoxide, rot, disease. The very thing that kept them alive could quietly kill them. So the ancient builders developed ventilation systems far more sophisticated than we would ever expect. Roof vents let the smoke escape while losing as little heat as possible. Bark flaps and layered coverings could be adjusted depending on the direction of the wind. Fires were placed carefully beneath controlled openings. And this was a constant, delicate balance. Too much ventilation and the precious heat escaped into the night. Too little, and the air itself turned poisonous. Life depended on getting it exactly right. But moisture was just as deadly, because wet cold kills far faster than dry cold. Damp clothing lost its power to insulate. Frozen condensation weakened the very structure of the lodge. Even the breath of the people inside slowly filled the air with dangerous humidity. So winter survival became a constant act of adjustment, drying the hides, rotating the bedding, managing the smoke, checking the airflow, banking the coals beneath the ash. The shelter was never passive. It was tended every single day like a living thing that had to be kept alive. And here is the truth that should stay with you. The deadliest threat was not the cold outside. It was the warmth they made inside. To survive, they had to master both at once. And for those who built their homes beside the frozen rivers, winter carried a sound that everyone feared in the dark. For the tribes living beside the mountain rivers, winter brought a danger all its own. The river gave them life, fish, water, a path to travel. But in the deep of winter, that same river could turn into a catastrophe. Ice jams triggered sudden violent floods. Frozen banks collapsed without warning, and the wind accelerated through the narrow valleys like a blade. So these river communities adapted. They built their winter pit lodges on raised terraces high above the flood zones. The structures still sank partly into the ground for warmth, but thick timber roofs held layers of insulation above. And some lodges used roof entrances instead of side doors, cutting the wind even further and locking the heat inside. Within, life organized itself around the central fire. Families slept along the raised edges. Food was kept high, where it stayed dry. Tools dried near the careful heat. Outside, the storm buried the entire valley. Inside, survival came down to discipline. The coals were banked low. The drainage trenches kept clear. The vents adjusted. The children kept far from the dangerous entrances. And the hunters watched the river ice from the high rocks, because everyone feared the same sound, the cracking of ice in the darkness. Many northern oral traditions speak of the winter river almost as a living being, unpredictable, powerful, dangerous. When the ice shifted, an entire camp could vanish. Floodwater surged beneath the frozen surface. Pressure shattered the banks. Heavy debris tore through the current in the black of night. And so the children learned early, and they learned it deeply. Never trust silent ice. That single lesson, passed from voice to voice across generations, was not just a story. It was survival knowledge, encoded into memory itself. But far from the rivers, another people faced an enemy that came not as cold but as water itself. In the frozen marshlands, the greatest danger was not the cold, it was moisture. The ground itself became unstable. Water froze and thawed. Again and again, a cold mist settled across the wetlands, and that wet air stripped the heat from a human body with terrifying speed. So the marshland peoples adapted in a remarkable way. They did not build down into the earth, they built upward. Their winter houses stood elevated on wooden posts, driven deep into the shallow, waterlogged ground. Raised platforms lifted families above the freezing moisture. Plank walkways kept them off the unstable ice. And thick walls of layered reeds wrapped the home in insulation. To an outsider, these houses might have looked fragile. In truth, they were precisely engineered. The reeds trapped countless pockets of air that slowed the loss of heat. The flexible walls bent with the storm winds instead of breaking. The steep roofs shed the snow and the rain. The raised platforms kept the damp drafts away from sleeping families. And once again, airflow was everything. Too much smoke trapped inside meant death. Too much ventilation meant the cold crept in. So the fires burned slowly. The reeds were replaced constantly. The lashings were tightened before every storm. The posts were inspected on the coldest nights. The structure itself had to breathe. And over generations, these communities discovered something extraordinary. A winter shelter, built with enough skill, could create its own microclimate. Warmer, drier, and calmer than the frozen world outside. They had not escaped winter. They had built a small, warm world inside it. And here is where the secret we promised at the very beginning finally comes into the light. Today, most people assume that ancient survival came down to toughness. But the archaeological evidence tells a very different story. These communities survived because they observed nature with incredible precision. They studied airflow and the behavior of snow. They studied ground temperature and the sounds of the ice. They watched the movement of animals, the direction of the wind, the patterns of moisture, and slowly, over many generations, they transformed those observations into architecture. And here is what should truly amaze us. Modern cold weather engineering still uses the very same principles. Thermal layering, passive insulation, low wind exposure, heat retention, controlled ventilation, moisture management. Even snow itself, used correctly, becomes insulation. The ancient tribes understood all of this without laboratories, without industry, without modern physics. They learned it through survival itself. And perhaps most importantly, they understood something our modern world so often forgets. Nature was never separate from human survival. It was part of the system. The earth became insulation. The moss became a ceiling. The stone stored heat. The trees broke the wind. The hides trapped warmth. Nothing existed alone. Every material belonged to the world around it, and they simply learned to listen to it. Today, most people assume that ancient survival came down to toughness. But the archaeological evidence tells a very different story. These communities survived because they observed nature with incredible precision. They studied airflow and the behavior of snow. They studied ground temperature and the sounds of the ice. They watched the movement of animals, the direction of the wind, the patterns of moisture, and slowly, over many generations, they transformed those observations into architecture. And here is what should truly amaze us. Modern cold weather engineering still uses the very same principles. Thermal layering, passive insulation, low wind exposure, heat retention, controlled ventilation, moisture management. Even snow itself, used correctly, becomes insulation. The ancient tribes understood all of this without laboratories, without industry, without modern physics. They learned it through survival itself. And perhaps most importantly, they understood something our modern world so often forgets. Nature was never separate from human survival. It was part of the system. The earth became insulation. The moss became a ceiling. The stone stored heat. The trees broke the wind. The hides trapped warmth. Nothing existed alone. Every material belonged to the world around it, and they simply learned to listen to it. Oh, let us return to the promise I made at the very start. The one survival technique that changed everything. It was this. They stopped fighting the freezing air, and instead, they sank their homes into the earth and let the ground and the snow become a living blanket of insulation around them. A few feet of soil, a wall of packed snow, a layer of moss and sod. Together, they turned the frozen world itself into the very thing that kept them warm. And here is what is astonishing. That exact principle is still used today in the snow shelters and Quin's Hees of modern survival schools, in the emergency techniques taught to soldiers and explorers in the Arctic. We rediscovered, with our science and our instruments, what these people had already known for thousands of years. They learned it not from a book, but from the wind, the snow, and the cost of every mistake. Now, return to the child from the beginning. The first blizzard they would ever remember, the screaming wind, the deadly white world outside, and yet they slept warm. Now you understand why. It was never luck. It was an entire system of wisdom, carved over 1,000 winters, wrapped around them in the dark. The earth holding its warmth, the low tunnel trapping the cold, the banked coals glowing softly, the breathing walls. The child was safe because they were never truly alone against the cold. Today, archaeologists still uncover the traces of these forgotten worlds beneath the forests and the frozen ground. Charcoal layers, post holes, collapsed roof beams, burned stone. To some, these remains seem silent, but they are not silent at all. A low tunnel entrance means someone understood how heat escapes. A raised sleeping platform means someone noticed where the cold air settles. Every feature carried memory. Every structure carried survival. And maybe that is the real answer to the question we began with. How did ancient tribes survive winters that should have killed them? Not through brute force, not through fearlessness, not through luck. They survived because they listened to the wind, to the rivers, to the snow, to the fire, to the land itself. And through that understanding, they created warmth inside a frozen world. Because sometimes the greatest things human beings ever built were not raised in great cities. Sometimes they burned quietly beneath the snow. And here, perhaps, is the part of the story that belongs to us. We live in a world that has never been warmer indoors and never further from understanding why. We flip a switch and the cold disappears. We turn a dial and the warmth returns. And somewhere in that comfort, we have quietly forgotten the knowledge these people carried in their hands and their memories, the knowledge that kept entire generations alive. They had no thermostats, no machines humming in the walls. What they had was attention. They watched where the cold air pooled and raised their beds above it. They felt where the wind cut hardest and turned their doorways away from it. They learned the sound of dangerous ice and the weight of safe snow. And they passed every lesson down, winter after winter, until survival itself became a kind of inheritance. And that is the quiet lesson hidden beneath all the engineering. That warmth was never only about heat, it was about paying attention to the land, to the season, to one another. A family huddled close was not just sharing body warmth, they were sharing the certainty that no one would face the dark alone. In a world that often feels colder in spirit than in temperature, that may be the most valuable thing they ever built. So the next time the wind howls against your window and you sit safe and warm without a second thought, remember them. Remember the child who slept through their first blizzard, wrapped not in technology, but in wisdom. Remember that long before our age of machines, human beings looked at the harshest winter on Earth, and instead of surrendering to it, they learned to listen and built a small, warm world inside the cold. So here is a question for you. Of all the forgotten secrets we uncovered tonight, which one surprised you the most? Tell me in the comments below, because I read them, and the best ideas often become the next story. And if you want to follow this journey further, stay close. Because next time, we travel into a land where winter lasts half the year to discover how the Vikings of the far north built their warmth against the endless dark. It is a story of fire, timber, and a people who refuse to let the night win. Until then, stay warm and stay curious.